Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Ballroom 2. I hope you all slept well and are kind of on top of things. Thank you for coming this early. Our next talk is from Yotam Meitar. He's doing a talk on responding to sophisticated ransomware attacks in the cloud, a real-world case study. I'd like to thank our sponsor, WithSecure. WithSecure Consulting is at the forefront of safeguarding organizations globally, recognized for our commitment to excellence and research-led approach. We are the trusted partner for companies where cybersecurity is not just a priority, but absolutely business critical. If you do have questions, we'll have 5 minutes at the end of the session. Please welcome Yotam.
Let's make sure. Wonderful. Sounds good. And my clicker is this. Great. So morning, everybody. I appreciate being here first thing 9 a.m., second day. I know it's not easy. I'm going to jump in, quickly introduce myself, and then the session, and we'll get to the good stuff. So my name's Yotam. I've been doing different cyber positions, both in the military and mainly in incident response for the last 10 years. As you can tell from my beautiful design, I'm recently part of Wiz. I was working for Gem Security, and we recently joined the Wiz family. I'm going to jump into the good stuff to the actual incident response story that I'm going to share in a second. I just want to mention a couple things first. So number one is, even though everything I'm sharing here is a true story and incident response events that I responded to and everything the way it unfolded, to protect client confidentiality, I have modified and sort of combined a few of the details. Everything's real, everything happened in these incidents, but just if you want to ask questions about what did this specific client do at that specific time, then I'm not going to answer that if it's too revealing. So that's number one. Number two is, as a bit of an introduction, usually when I do these kinds of IR talks, attack story talks, I refer a lot to the attacker's perspective and what they did and how they started their attack. But this is different. This is going to be different. We're going to start off right at the end of the attack, and there's a reason for that. The reason is that specifically when talking about ransom attacks in the cloud, we're seeing an interesting and kind of an alarming trend. So for a while there, it seemed like cloud environments were not immune, but let's say more secure from standard ransomware attacks because of the way that they're built, right? Ransomware, the classic old-fashioned actual heavy malware that goes and encrypts, is just less fit for purpose for the cloud. And we're still seeing very little of that in cloud environments, of actual malware, ransomware being used. However, what we are seeing is a major rise in ransom attacks, not ransomware attacks, just ransom attacks, where attackers come in, they don't try to encrypt things. That happens sometimes, but more rarely. Instead, what they do is they're in the environment, they take a lot of data, and they only use that part of the extortion to demand a ransom based on data. And that's why the attack that I'm going to describe today starts here. So we're essentially starting at the end of the attack. What we're seeing here, is a real ransom note sent to our victim. In this case, the victim is a large tech company. I'm not going to say a lot more than that about the victim, but they have very large cloud environments, mostly in AWS. They have hundreds of AWS accounts used by mostly developers and DevOps guys in like over 50 countries, very large environment managed across a lot of places. And what we're seeing here is a pretty standard, simple ransom note that was sent to a bunch of people, both low-level and executives within the company, essentially claiming, I marked up the two key parts here in red, but essentially claiming we have all your data, whatever that means, and we will release it in 48 hours. That's your deadline. They want payment, and there's a link for the dark website where you can communicate with these attackers. Now, the blacked out parts are just things that could identify the client or the timing, but we have the relevant parts in front of us. Now, when this happened to the company, they got this ransom note. They also got a pretty hefty pile of data as proof of life. So the attackers right away just sent a lot of examples of stolen data. They claimed this is just a dump of everything because they don't care that the client knows. They want them to know, right? They want the extortion to be effective. And it was huge. It was a few hundreds of gigabytes of JSONs just sent over from the attacker. And the company started sifting through these. They weren't fully sure what was taken from where in the environment, but when they started looking through this, they saw that this indeed contained most of their client databases, including a lot of customer PII. So the company's most sensitive data, it's not credit card numbers here, not PCI, but still a lot of sensitive stuff for this company. And a decision was made pretty quickly that regardless of anything else that they're going to do, they need to pay. They're not willing to support the pain of this data being leaked. And the initial asking price was high, but again, Bitcoin keeps fluctuating, so I can't tell you exactly how much it was at the time. But it was high, but it was negotiated down, and the company paid. The company paid the ransom, and that's our starting point for this story, which is not the way it usually goes. But that's where the relevant, interesting incident response part actually starts. Now, before I even get to the investigatory parts and figuring out how the attack happens, the company, when we started getting involved, had an initial challenge which was more annoying, but also more urgent. And many of you may encounter this if you're dealing with live incidents or incident response. And that's current legal issues and regulatory issues which haunt the industry. Now, there's a lot of different things which may apply, also different jurisdictions. But just to give you a taste, here in the US, of a couple of the things that are relevant. First of all, we have the SEC, right? So the Securities and Exchange Commission, they're not a cyber agency, but they are getting more and more into the cyber games. They put out major cyber rules last year. They had some rules before that. This is just an example from the recent rule, and we're not going to read the whole thing. It's pretty boring. But notice a couple things that they say here. They're saying that when materiality determination, meaning when you determine that an incident is material, whatever that means, very, very hard to determine, when you determine that, then without unreasonable delay after discovering an incident, you have to report the incident to the SEC within 4 business days. Now, the problem here is that reporting, let's say in this case for this company, obviously they had a massive data leak, they paid a ransom, they know that this is a material incident. Let's assume that's not even in question, even though you could argue for such a big company whether such a small ransom payment, considering their revenue, is material. But assuming that it is, there's still a lot of question of what do you actually report. You need to know a lot about the incident and about what's going on and get a handle on it before you can release it to the public. And there are other concerns. This is just one example. This one happens to be from Connecticut, but I just wanted to show you because each state and each jurisdiction has their own messy little rules. But Connecticut also tells any company that may have experienced a data breach, you also have to notify your customers, and you have to notify the Connecticut Attorney General. And you have to do these things also within different time frames and under different limitations. Now, this becomes a big problem because this company here, different deadlines, let's say 4 days here, 60 days here, there's a bunch of other deadlines from other jurisdictions. They operate globally. They have a lot of jurisdictions they have to work under. And this company doesn't know exactly the scope of the leak, and worse, they don't know exactly who or how many of their customers were impacted. And that's a huge, huge difference, because from the company's perspective, paying the ransom hurts, but that's one thing. However, if they had to now notify every single one of their customers that they lost their data, and if they had to do that in many different jurisdictions according to many different rules, that hurts the company a lot more. It hurts their reputation, it hurts their ability to retain these customers, and they have very short time frames to figure this out. Now, if they don't figure it out in time, what often happens, every company has their own strategy, but what often happens is the companies err on the side of caution here, together with their lawyers, and they just over-report in a way. They say, okay, we know that this data set was compromised, so let's assume everybody in that data set as a customer had their data stolen, and they report to all of them, and that could really hurt the company, especially if not everything was taken. So the very first challenge that we had here in doing incident response wasn't really a forensic investigation. It was figuring out exactly what data was and was not taken. Now, the attackers, especially once the ransom was paid, were very accommodating. They said, yeah, we sent you all the data. So it depends if you believe them or not, but there was also no indication that they hadn't. More than that, the logging in the environment was pretty limited. It was not too well configured, but it appeared that almost everything the attackers had taken had come from S3 buckets. S3 logging was not enabled, unfortunately, but it came from S3 buckets and not other places. And that meant that we thought we could try to just compare stuff in the S3 bucket to what we got from the attackers and figure out whether we have a match, and then we'll know what was taken. Now, when we tried to do that, we started hitting an interesting complication, which is something we don't usually think of when we're doing forensics or incident response. In this case, this is just an example. So the company had most of this sensitive customer data in MongoDBs in their AWS environment, and these MongoDBs had backups in S3. These backups were BSON files. For those of you who know Mongo, it's the way that you can export some similar to JSON from Mongo. But the attackers sent us JSON files. And if we just try to compare the attackers' JSON files to files which we thought would be matching BSON files from the company's environment, we didn't get matches. So this is just an example, right? But we're getting different file hashes. And we could start to analyze every single record in the attacker's file one by one, but that would take way longer than the deadlines that we now have because of the legal requirements. And plus, that's something that's going to be more of a lawyer job anyway than something that we can help with. So the lawyers came to us, executive management came to us, what do we do about this? How do we get out of this jam quickly? Or else we're just going to have to pretty much over-report everything, and that's going to hurt us a lot. So what we started doing here is we figured, OK, we're not allowed to do anything to the attacker's file, because that's what they sent. And if we want to have some legal cover in saying, this is what the attacker sent, and here's the matching data on our side so we know what was taken, we can't touch the attacker's file. So all we can do is try to mess with the company's files, the backups, to try to change them up a little bit until we get something that matches the attacker's files. So to do this, it's kind of a weird thing that we don't usually try to do in investigations and in forensics. We started going step by step and analyzing the differences. So first was easy, right? We wanted to convert these BSON files into JSON files to see if maybe that's the whole difference. Maybe the attacker just had a different sort of export mechanism. We don't know what the attacker did behind the scenes to get to this data, but that wasn't enough. That was the first step, but that was very simple. Didn't solve the problem. We didn't get the same file hashes. So now what we had to do, and this it sounds very silly, but what we had to do is actually try to analyze bit by bit, character by character, the differences between attacker files and our files. So we started by looking for files that looked similar, in size, and we were hoping would match because the names weren't the same. And then we started analyzing, literally going character by character, looking for the differences, and we started finding very small differences, which honestly, to this day, I'm not sure how they happened or what the attacker did. It was kind of annoying to find them, but the more we dug into it, the more of these we found. And I'm going to give you just a few examples. We found a lot more than this, but one example is just encoding nonsense. So we found in many cases, our file would have, the company's file would have something like an ampersand, but the attacker would have the Unicode encoding for an ampersand. Why? I have no idea. I don't know what the attacker did to the data. I don't know what we did to the data. That's just the way it was, even though the attacker probably originally took and exported the same files. But we said, OK, so let's run a script over all the company's backup files and change this into this. Try to solve the problem. We looked for more and more of these issues. For example, timestamps, so sometimes it was Unix timestamps in one area or textual timestamps in other areas. Sometimes it was reversed. Honestly, I don't understand exactly why this happened, but this was a very slow, painstaking effort to try and figure out every difference. The last one that I want to point out here, just because it was the silliest one, is this nonsense. If you notice the way the numbers represented here, the E is capitalized versus not capitalized. Again, don't know why, what exactly happened on the attacker's side here, but these differences are things that we found, and by doing this sort of slow, very manual forensic effort on a few files to map out these differences, once we had each difference mapped up, of course, we just automated running this correction on all the backup files on the client side, until finally, we're all very happy. This took a couple days to get to the final result, but we were able to get to, I don't expect you to read the entire file hash, but we got the same file hash. So we were able to get the company's backup files to modify them in a way where they matched exactly everything that we got from the attacker. Now, this enabled the company to say, yes, we didn't have perfect logging, right? We don't know exactly everything that the attacker did, but we paid. The attacker gave us everything that they claim they have, and we have no reason to think that anything else was compromised. And if there's no reasonable presumption like that, then they don't have to report it like that. And we have matching files on our side. Once we have the matching files, the company could say exactly, OK, these are customers from these jurisdictions and not these. In this case, this led to reporting requirements in about 10 different jurisdictions instead of over 100. So it was really a huge difference from the company. And this wasn't even a standard part of the investigation. It was just this little messy thing, which took some work and did a lot of good in the incident response effort. So putting this behind us, just this little data adventure, we can finally get into the good stuff and the actual investigation, figuring out what happened in the attack. So I'm going to walk you through this from our perspective as investigators, but I first want to quickly explain how access is managed to pretty much all resources in this company's AWS environment. So like I mentioned, huge AWS environments, hundreds of accounts, many, many countries, but impressively, if you look at all of these AWS accounts, this entire environment only had 5 IAM users. That's it, in the entire environment. The reason for this is that the company they had their own identity provider, their own proprietary one, which they built and managed themselves. And almost every single access performed by anyone or any machine in the company had to go through this identity provider. Now, to understand the attack, we need just a quick, very high-level overview of this identity provider architecture. At a very high level, when an employee or a machine, but when somebody that deserves and wants access to this company's AWS environment wants to get in there, what they do is they browse this identity provider. They have an API, they have a GUI, they do it either way. They browse the identity provider. The identity provider does have one of those 5 IAM users. That identity provider can use its own access key to access AWS. And once it does that, it goes to Secrets Manager to get this key every time in AWS, connects to the cloud environment, and then using STS, it creates a token, right? So a temporary session token, which then gets assigned to the user based on the role, the privileges, everything that they should have for this specific session, based on determinations made by the identity provider itself. So just at a high level, this is how access is managed. Now, the reason this is interesting, of course, is because we did have some logs, not perfect logging, but we did have some logs, and we wanted to figure out where the attacker could have come from. So we didn't have full S3 logging to know which files were taken when, but we did see some activity around S3, which was suspicious or not suspicious, good users, bad users. We wanted to figure this out. And when we started looking more into it, what we found is this. So some of the stuff here is redacted, of course, because it has to do with the company, but at a high level, when looking at CloudTrail logs for activities which we deem to be suspicious, which we deem to be part of the attack, what we saw is that when the attacker performed these malicious activities, they came from STS sessions, just like legitimate sessions performed within the environment, and they had, very importantly, the same session name convention that we would see for the identity provider. So very quickly, when this identity provider, like I said, it was proprietary, so nobody else uses it, but when this identity provider would create sessions for valid users, it would always, within this string that you get in CloudTrail of logs, it would always create a session name, this attribute in AWS, which followed the same convention. It just contained the name of the user at the name of the identity provider. That's just the way that it worked. That's just how they did it. You could put whatever you want in a session name. They could have put banana in there, but this is the way they chose to do it. And when we looked at the malicious activities, they looked the same way. They all looked like they're coming from STS, following this convention. So the initial thought, the instinct, was, I guess this means that the attacker also somehow came through the identity provider because it looks like it's authenticated the same way. Everything looks right. Now, that would be very concerning because the identity provider also has multi-factor authentication, and it has original IP restrictions, and it has a lot of other things to secure the company, and it would be difficult, not impossible, of course. They can hijack a session of somebody who's authenticated, but it would be difficult to do. However, before we just went forward with this assumption that the attackers must have gone through the identity provider, we figured let's take a look at another log source here, just because we could, and we looked. So, sorry, this is just at a high level to understand the attack itself. So we know that the attackers were able to get to these MongoDB backups from S3. We know that this was presumably done through the identity provider, but what we figured we should do here is look at the identity provider itself. It didn't have amazing logging. They were all textual and local on the actual machine, but they existed. And when we looked at those, this is the wonderful result that we got: nothing. So we were looking at the identity provider logs. I'm glad you're laughing. It was very strange for us to begin with, because we looked at the identity provider logs, which we didn't know were that good to begin with, but we saw that we couldn't find the corresponding authentications to the ones that we were seeing in CloudTrail. So we were seeing logging that shows something like an attacker coming in through the identity provider, but no actual access to the identity provider. And after doing some testing ourselves, we figured, okay, these logs look reliable. We can't get around them in any way. So this means they didn't actually come through the identity provider. Now, if they didn't come through the identity provider, but they did manage to make it look just like this, there's really only one way for the attackers to do this, and that is if they got the key that's used, the access key used by the identity provider to create these sessions. So if you remember before when I ran through the architecture, the identity provider does have an access key associated with one of these 5 unique IAM users. And if an attacker has that access key, sure, they could do the same, right? They could generate SDS tokens. They can make it look just like a session that came through the identity provider. But only thanks to the fact that we could compare these two log sources were we able to say for sure they are doing this sort of faking, but they are not actually coming through the identity provider. And that's a major understanding for us, because when we looked into it, and we looked everywhere, trust me, we saw that the only place that that key was stored was in that secrets manager value, a single secrets manager value, which is theoretically only used by the identity provider itself, right? The identity provider is supposed to be accessing it when it needs to create these sessions legitimately, but nobody else should ever be accessing this value. So going further back in our investigation, we now think, okay, this secrets manager value must have been access must have been compromised somehow. Let's look at the secret compromise itself. And when we start looking at the logs, again, I apologize, a lot of this is redacted, but the interesting parts are here. So we're seeing different accesses that occurred to this specific value, to this specific secret in Secrets Manager. And we're seeing that there's one which is different, one which stands out. And what essentially is happening here is that every single access that we've seen in the history of the logging that we had, it didn't go back forever, but we did have enough. Every single access was always performed from the same IP address, exactly in the same way. It was the identity provider itself doing what it should be, except for one time. Just this one time, suddenly the same key, the key that's used by the identity provider and was presumably used by the attacker for the entire attack, that same key was accessed by some EC2 instance role from some EC2 IP address. That's strange. That shouldn't happen. That's different from what we've been seeing happen until this point. And that made us think naturally, okay, so this EC2 must be somehow involved, and the EC2 IAM role, which allowed this access, and we saw it was configured to allow this access, that's how the attacker was able to do it, must be compromised as well. So if we're going back in our chain of understanding the attack, these MongoDB backups were taken from S3 because the attacker was able to bypass the identity provider, because they were able to access Secrets Manager, because they were able to compromise this EC2 IAM role. Great. So how did they get this EC2 IAM role? That's the next question, the next obvious thing we want to figure out. And when we go to figure that out, luckily we did have pretty much, not constant, but let's say pretty good taking of AMIs, of Amazon Machine Images, from a lot of EC2s in the environment, including the one associated with the role we had here. So we had different AMIs we could compare from different time frames so that we can try to figure out what happened on that machine when bad things started happening, because we have some presumed time frames for this attack now. And when we started looking at the machine itself, it was actually pretty straightforward. Right away, we started seeing some things that are strange. So this is a bash history from the machine itself. What we can see on it is some activities. We're not going to get through everything. There's some use of AWS API. But what we can see is the specific secret that was targeted in this case. Again, the secret name is redacted, but that was accessed through an AWS command line, through a CLI on the machine. So that machine had an IAM role associated with it, which allowed access to that secret, right? That's mistake number one. But once we understand that, we can actually go to the machine, and through very simple forensics, in this case just bash history, we can find evidence that this was actually used to access the secret. So we now know for sure that this specific EC2 was used. And the question that obviously comes first to our minds is, what is this EC2? How was it compromised? What's going on? What is this machine? And unfortunately, what we were quickly able to see is that this machine was actually a Kubernetes pod. It was running within a larger cluster that was used in this environment for a lot of different production applications. Again, like I mentioned, huge AWS environment. But this Kubernetes pod was just running on an EC2. And unfortunately, that's where this whole thing appeared to have started. So that made us think, okay, so why? Like, how could the attacker get to a pod? Why are they getting to a pod? How are they operating within this environment? And that, of course, leads to further investigating what's going on in this cluster, in this Kubernetes cluster. Now, this is where things get a little bit more complicated because, it's Kubernetes. There's not a lot of things that are persistent necessarily. There's a lot of ephemeral things there that we could miss. Plus, because the environment was so huge, people were spinning up and taking down applications there all the time. All the time. That's just how the company operated. So this made it more difficult. We couldn't find the right logging in different places to figure out what happened there. But what we were able to see was that not long before the attacker gained this initial access to this EC2, to the Kubernetes pod, what we saw is that a specific application was deployed to the Kubernetes, a specific application within Kubernetes, not an EC2 application. And this application, which was deployed, actually had a very well-known exploitable vulnerability in it. It was actually deployed knowing this. So in retrospect, I can tell you, when it was deployed, it was not deployed meaning to go into production. It was deployed, the person who deployed it thought they were doing it and only limiting it to internal access because they wanted to do some testing on that application. They didn't think it was internet accessible. However, again, just a mistake or bad luck, the person who deployed it. Later on, somebody used the same security group, which was controlling access to this application in order to control access to something else, and they enabled access from the internet. So two completely separate incidents. Some guy was using an application they thought was completely blocked off from the internet. Again, I wouldn't do it in production, but they thought they weren't doing anything wrong. Another guy, again, thought they were doing nothing wrong. They were using a security group which they knew and they had been modifying for a few years now, once in a while, to do different things in the applications. They allowed access from the internet. So once that happened, we had a vulnerable application within this Kubernetes cluster, which was accessible from the internet, and very quickly it was scanned. Presumably, this is just a screenshot from Gem where we can see what happened here. We can see an external IP address. In this case, it's just a Proton VPN IP, which was able to connect to this application through just presumably scanning. It's not like somebody knew about this. But once they had scanned the vulnerable application, they were able to run code on the EC2, which was hosting the Kubernetes pod. So now we understand pretty much the full flow of the attack here, right? We have our attackers were scanning randomly, probably. They got lucky with this application and the misconfigured security group, which enabled them access to Kubernetes, to the EC2, which had an IAM role configured to allow access to Secrets Manager. That Secrets Manager access allowed them to bypass or fake access to the identity provider, which allowed access to S3, and finally, to extract the MongoDB backups. Now, before I move on to some takeaways from this stuff and some more interesting facts, there's something that I want to mention about this whole attack stream. So from the moment the attackers got their first access there, this access to Kubernetes through the scan, until the moment that they had sent the ransom note, it was just a couple days. It was very fast, and the fact that it was so fast is unfortunately very common when these attacks happen in the cloud. So the cloud is, I always say, it's not more or less inherently secure, but there are advantages and disadvantages for both attackers and defenders. And speed is just a common thing because these environments all pretty much look the same, and we're all pretty much using the same 3 vendors for all our cloud environments. And because attackers know this too, they can automate and they can move a lot more quickly than they would in standard attacks, especially ransomware attacks in on-prem environments where they first have to do some recon, figure out where the critical assets are. But here, S3 containing data, shocking. The fact that there's secrets manager values which allow access to things, again, very shocking, right? So the attackers that know these facts leverage them to move very quickly, and that's how even a small or short-lived mistake, like the one we had here with the security group and the application being misconfigured, can pretty quickly lead to something dramatic for the company, and here it did. So that's why I think that this is an interesting story from the Cloud IR perspective, because it highlights how quickly things can escalate this way, and even through pretty small mistakes and configurations along the way, as long as they're there, the risk is there as well. So with that, I want to move to 3 key points that I want to leave you with that I take away from this specific story and from many other cloud incident response engagements as well. And then I'll leave a couple minutes for questions. So first of all, high-speed leak investigations are something that we're not used to. And when I'm talking about leak investigations, I'm not just talking about immediate response stuff. It's not just about being able to kick out an attacker that's active in the environment. That's always important. That always has to happen fast. And that's something that we have been doing in on-prem environments as well for many years. But now, given both the legal and regulatory issues that I mentioned in the beginning, and how quickly attackers are moving in the cloud, and also how easily they can exfiltrate different kinds of data, This is becoming really a must. And preparing for this need, whether you're working for an organization that you're securing or whether you're a consultant doing this for many other organizations, doesn't just mean that you need to be willing to work a lot of hours and to be fast. It means that in preparing in advance, we need to do a much better job of mapping out which data we have where in the cloud, because for example, this company didn't have a good grasp on that, and that was a problem. But also mapping out what we would do and actually testing and drilling what we would do if we have to answer these kinds of questions, like the ones that I shared here in the beginning, of what data exactly was taken, how much, who's impacted, and collaborate on that, not just with the technical teams, but with legal teams and anybody else who may be involved. Because, for example, knowing which regions or which buckets or whatever it is for your organization contain whose data, and the likelihood of that being impacted and whether you have the right logging to figure that out is a must, especially given these shrinking deadlines and more involvement from regulators and other people in putting pressure on companies to do this. So this is really becoming an inherent part of incident response, especially in the cloud because of speed and scalability. It makes it much harder to map this out, and it becomes really important. That's number one. Number two has to do with logging specifically when it comes to data. So I mentioned, the leak investigations, and of course that's important. But too many times, way too many times, when we get into an incident, when we start investigating, we see that even companies that have invested and have pretty good logging in different areas of their environment are failing specifically on the data side. So here it was S3 logging, which I mentioned, but at a wider scale, almost every organization eventually figures out, oh, we don't have RDS audit logging, or in this case, there was also MongoDB. There was no logging on access to that database, or other pieces of data, which, again, because of the way that these cloud environments are operating, are becoming the only critical asset. So yes, there are ransomware attacks which try to actually encrypt and do stuff like that that's disruptive in the cloud. That's the minority. The vast majority are only going for the data. And understanding this, that operating in a cloud environment, even for companies for whom data may not have been the top priority, maybe it was always downtime, maybe it was just availability, we don't have that much sensitive data, it's not our thing, I've heard people say that. Still, this can cause a lot of heartache when these attacks happen, and ensuring that there's proper logging for access to all these things is critical. There's also a question of figuring out what kind of data you have in different places. There's one case that I had a very different kind of incident. This was actually an on-prem ransomware incident, but the company was very confident because they said, listen, we have immutable backups in Azure for everything we care about. So even if we get this encryption for our on-prem environment, we'll be fine. And that was true. They had this great immutable backup, but what they didn't realize is that immutable backup was client-side encrypted. They had their own keys, and they had 4 different keys to different parts of the backup. One of the keys, the key itself, was only stored in one place. It was also stored in the cloud. And what attackers did is they encrypted the file that contained the key itself. So great, they have backup. The backup is perfect, right? But the company can't access about a quarter of it. That's a big problem. In that case, we're able to do something clever. Attackers and ransomware attacks, they give you proof of life. You can upload a few files, so they decrypt them just to show they can. We gave them the key file. They gave it back. So that was wonderful. The company didn't have to pay, and they got out of it. But think about what would have happened if they didn't. Because they didn't know about this specific piece of data. It's a key. It's not even sensitive data, or not PII at least. But because they weren't properly tracking where it is and access to it, attackers were able to get away with something like that, which destroyed their entire recovery plan. Luckily, we're able to get away with it here, but not necessarily in every other case. And that really highlights the importance of mapping the data and the logging of access to it. Now, the last point I want to make here has to do with centralizing forensics and logging across the cloud. So unfortunately, in a lot of cloud environments, even people who have the right logs enabled or know how to do cloud forensics very well, they often miss things, and they miss the quicker attacks because they can't connect dots from different places quickly enough. So if relying on a single log source like CloudTrail is effective, and it is effective for a lot of things, it's never going to be fully effective in an environment that's very interconnected. Now, being able to have things like database audit logging and stuff like CloudTrail and stuff VPC flow logs and stuff like specific application logging, we're talking about Kubernetes here, but it could be anything. Having all these things centralized in a single place is really critical, not only to being able to perform a good investigation, because sure, when you're performing an investigation, it's easier where you have everything in one place and you can correlate. So I mentioned before that a lot of the breaks that we got in this investigation came due to the fact that we were able to correlate the CloudTrail logs with the IDP logs that were just stored locally on the server. So during an investigation, we got lucky these logs were locally on the server, we could use them. Of course, it would have been much easier if these were initially centralized to one place, and then these correlations could not only be made during an investigation, but live. So the kind of information that we're looking for here could also serve for effective detection. And a lot of the more sophisticated attacks that we're seeing are being detected by exactly stuff like this. They know that they can model, all these cloud environments are the same. The attackers know how to model getting away with certain things within CloudTrail logs or VPC flow logs or specific applications logs. But when you know your own organization and you have heuristic analyses which look for anomalies across all these things together, then your environment is unique, and that's where you get a much bigger advantage when compared to attackers, because you have the home field advantage, they don't, and they lose that huge advantage they get from everything being the same when you have tailored alerting based on centralization of logging from many different places, which allow this kind of tailored, unique detection. So that's the last point I want to leave you with here. We got a couple minutes left for some questions or comments if anybody has anything. Yes?
Thank you. Hey, great talk. I was curious, have you noticed any patterns across organizations of different sizes of the reason for why data logging, for example, is it cost cutting but still meeting regulatory compliance, or is it a lack of change management processes with the security groups? Do you find that there are noticeable patterns depending on what industry the companies might be a part of or the size of the organization?
Yeah, I think industry more than size in my experience. I think because I've seen very small organizations doing very well and very large ones doing very badly and vice versa. But industry, of course. I mean, there's industries that are just either a lot more regulated or just a lot more attentive to this stuff. So there's obviously going to be a difference between banks and financial institutions or retail or people who think that they don't have any sensitive data, like a lot of times in manufacturing and stuff like that, where they figure, yeah, we just need uptime. We don't care about that stuff. So that causes really big differences. I think another point to remember here is that cost could be a reasonable discussion when it comes to these things, but many times companies that are missing this stuff, it's not because they had the discussion and made a very thoughtful decision, okay, we just can't afford this kind of logging. It's because they didn't even try to begin with. That's more often the case in my experience, that either because they assumed the cost was prohibitive, though it might not be, or because just nobody took the time to do this because it just wasn't prioritized. I think that's a lot more common for the companies that get hit the worst, at least from what I see in incident response. So that's why taking a proactive approach and modeling and drilling these things and then seeing what you're missing is really key here.
Great story, thanks. And I have two questions. First, you might have mentioned, but how did the attacker break out from the Kubernetes pod to the EC2 node? And the second question is, it seems the EC2 node that got compromised already have very high privilege that can access secret manager. Did the attacker use that role to try to access the S3 bucket? And probably the third question, sorry. How did the attacker, you mentioned there are 5 roles in that the organization use. How did the attacker figure out that this is the role that can access the crown and jewel of the organization? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think I remember everything. I'll start with the last one because I think that it's the most interesting one. I don't want to give too many details because some of you may recognize some of this from the media and stuff because this attack was published. But actually, because there were so few IAM users here, not just roles, users, only 5 users, and the attacker stole the key used by a specific user, what the attacker was able to do through good intelligence work on this company is figure out that this user is the one which basically has all the privileges because it's the only one that grants access to any other users. The EC2 itself, you were asking about how it was able to, the EC2 didn't have access to the S3 buckets, but the EC2 IAM role, the role that was attached to this EC2 and therefore everything running on it, including the Kubernetes pod, that did have permissions to access Secrets Manager. And that access to Secrets Manager allowed getting that key, and that key allowed creating the fake SDS session, which allowed access to everything. So it's a string of very specific, not too small, but not too big mistakes or misconfigurations, which eventually led to a very quick attack and a very successful one.
Hey, thank you for the talk. Thoughts on OFAC for ransomware payments?
We don't have that long, but I think generally it's interesting. I have seen companies, rarely, but I have seen companies that have made the decision not to pay because of this, because of fear from OFAC limiting payment to specific entities. OFAC is like the treasury body that manages sanctions. So like if there's a sanctioned entity, like a lot of the Russian ransomware groups, then you're not allowed to pay as a US company. You're just not allowed to. The thing is, attackers are smart, and they give you a reason to have enough doubt so that you can pay in most cases. So they always use a brand new wallet, and they don't necessarily identify themselves in the same names. And OFAC doesn't just say you're not allowed to pay ransom, period. They say you're not allowed to pay these groups or these suspected countries. And the attackers are smart enough to play in that little wiggle room. You go to the lawyers, you give them the wallet address, they check, they say, yeah, it's brand new. Okay, doesn't specifically impact OFAC, do whatever you want. So that's the majority of cases, but not all of them.
The first takeaway you had, moving quickly to triage and assess the damage. Have you noticed in your experience differences in the capabilities to do that between large and small organizations, or maybe organizations that are cloud native versus hybrid organizations where maybe that, muscle memory isn't there? And how have you seen companies that do it well implement it?
So first of all, yeah, the differences are huge, I think. There's a lot of variance in this. I think, again, size is not necessarily the best indicator because I've seen small and great. It also really depends on the industry. So a small company that's a cloud-native startup may be really good at this because they know what they're doing, versus a larger company that's been around for 100 years and they just started their cloud journey and they don't really know what they're doing there. So I think it's more a question of like the attention that this gets and whether you have people who know what they're doing specifically here. I think that one thing you mentioned, which is a common mistake, especially for large organizations, when they're transitioning to the cloud, they basically say, yeah, we know how to do security. We have 100, 200, 500 people security team. We can just basically copy-paste what we've been doing on-prem to the cloud. And again, I'm not saying the cloud is more or less inherently secure, but it's different. And unless you have people who know what they're doing in the cloud and who know how to operate both investigations, but also just creating detections and managing security in the cloud, it's very hard to do. So I think a lot of the cases where the impact is dramatic, despite having a large security team and people who try to operate this stuff, is exactly that. It's people who haven't really shifted their mindset to the cloud. And definitely, I mean, that's a whole different talk, but hybrid environments are much more challenging for many reasons. That's just one of them.
If I can add to your answer on the first question regarding logging, based on my experience, what I've seen also in incident response is typically organizations, they deploy systems, they deploy platforms, and they don't have an afterthought about logging or incident response on those systems. So that's one of the reasons also we see high rotation of logs instead of having retention of those logs. The question that I have for you, based on the speed at which the actor moved through the infrastructure, do you say that it's an actor that has high sophistication, or a low sophistication actor with a good knowledge of AWS would have been able to move this fast?
So that's an interesting question. I think that it's not, I mean, we don't know enough about them here from this story at least, to come to any sweeping conclusions. I think none of the actions that were taken here are especially sophisticated, maybe except for the way that they imitated the identity provider in logging. Because once they got the key for the identity provider, they could have just used it, in a much more violent way. They could have just gone in and done stuff, but instead they mimicked the same way the identity provider worked. They created an STS session with the same convention for a session name, and that indicates to me that these guys really cared about not being caught within the moment. They knew what they were doing. So that's maybe a higher level of sophistication. The rest of it, I mean, scanning and then using an IAM route, like 80% of this you could just automate. So I don't think that necessarily indicates sophistication as much as it indicates really just cloud-native attackers who know what they're targeting and they know what they're doing.
So first of all, thanks for the presentation. I have a question. In your experience, have you had to deal with a threat actor that used an AWS service like KMS as an encryption method to stuff like S3 buckets? There is a research for that. So have you had the chance to catch a threat actor using that?
I have seen that, but to be honest, I started with this too. It's, at least in my experience, very rare so far, just because the cloud environments inherently, they're just easier to recover from this stuff. So in many cases, there's going to be backups. There may be some immutable backups. So the encryption itself is usually less of a priority than just taking data and asking for a ransom. I have seen it, yes, both with KMS or, by the way, just making copies of the data and then trying to just delete it and delete all the backups, not even necessarily to encrypt. But in my view, this kind of attack, the only data-focused and ransom demand is probably more prevalent and is going to remain more prevalent. Yeah, so I don't know exactly what they did on their side, of course. In this case, I have no reason to think that they encrypted the data, because they downloaded it, and then they kept it, and they shared it unencrypted. So I see no reason for them to encrypt it, but they definitely did something to it, because changes happen. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the questions. Another round of applause for Yotam.
Thank you.